Hey everyone, welcome in. Happy Sunday. I'm here to bring you guys today for our fireside chat a brief breakdown on some of the important Supreme Court cases that came from the John Marshall Court that we have not already spoken about together in class. As a brief recap, we already hit up three Marshall cases this past week, that related to Native American relationships. That was the McIntosh case in 1823. The Cherokee Nation case versus Georgia in 1831, where Marshall ruled that Cherokees, since they were not citizens, could not file a lawsuit in the Supreme Court. And then lastly, the Worcester case, where Cherokees were granted, according to Marshall, sovereignty from the state of Georgia. If you go way back when, with the first case we talked about Marshall, though, was Marbury versus Madison. And really what ties everything together today is the bottom line theme, which is that no matter what, John Marshall's court and the rulings that he delivered almost always came down to upholding federalism. So if you can remember that major theme, no matter what case you see or no matter what briefing of Marshall's that you come across, you can apply that logic to answering almost every question. However, I'm going to give you four more Marshall cases. And I'm going to try something new. I'm going to put some slides in the background here that you guys could take notes off of, and I hope that that ends up helping you guys out together today with this fireside chat. So, that being said, let's get down to business. I mentioned we had three cases last week that dealt with Native Americans, but the first Marshall case that he actually dealt with Native Americans was Fletcher V Peck, 1810. Fletcher V Peck, very similar to the McIntosh case, dealt with Native Americans' rights to land when purchased from whites, primarily whites. And this case actually took place in the state of Georgia, which interestingly would be where all the turmoil would eventually come. So what did Marshall rule in this case? Well, basically that the state of Georgia could not refuse land grants to private citizens once there's a contract. This is a really important case for that specific reason. Marshall, in this instance, in the Fletcher V Peck ruling, upheld the idea of contracts. So keep that in mind, contracts. Not only did Marshall uphold federalism oftentimes in his cases, but he also upheld individual rights against the states. So federalism and individualism were key components of Marshall's ruling here in the Fletcher V Peck ruling, because he said the state could not violate a contract. Speaking of contracts, here's the second Marshall case involving contracts. Dartmouth College versus Woodward, 1819. Kind of an interesting story here. Dartmouth was a private school. It still is today, but the state of New Hampshire was trying to make it and take its charter from being private to public. So in this instance, what occurred, basically the school wanted to, the state wanted the school's charter to go to become a public school. However, Daniel Webster, whose name we've known so far, he was a war hawk and one of the really important representatives that came from the early 1800s. Daniel Webster was actually argued this case in front of the Supreme Court, and in the end, Marshall's court ruled that the state does not have the power to change a contract. Mirror ruling in a lot of ways to the Fletcher v. Peck ruling, and again, it upholds the individual, or in this case, the organization's rights from being changed by state governments or by private corporations. So two rulings, Dartmouth ruling and the Fletcher v. Peck ruling, where Marshall awards the victory to people that were being threatened to lose their contract. Another 1819 case to go over is McCulloch v. Marilyn. Now, granted, in hindsight, I probably should have introduced this case sooner, but while we're on the subject of Marshall cases, this is a good timing. So basically, the issue with the McCulloch v. Marilyn, the state of Maryland was trying to tax the second bank of the United States. Like many southern states, the southern states did not like the bank, the national bank. So given that the bank was newly created in 1816 during Henry Clay's American system, the state of Maryland was trying to tax the bank. Well, This is a big win for the federal government because Marshall basically argues that Congress has implied powers. I know this is a term that you guys talked extensively about in AP Gov. So this is where implied powers comes down. And there's a famous quote from Marshall's ruling here. And he says, quote, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." So he argues that if the states have the right to tax the national bank or any federal institution, that's granting the states way too much power. Marshall also says, as the notes will say here, the federal government was created by the people, not the states. So in this case, he's upholding the supremacy of the federal government once again. And that's an interesting point, though, because if you take the arguments that Calhoun made in the nullification crisis, something we learned about this week, you can clearly see how Marshall's viewpoints on the government totally strays from other states' rights activists. And the last ruling, speaking of states, was the Gibbons v Ogden ruling in 1824. This was a case where in New York State, the state had granted a monopoly to a shipping company along the Hudson River, but because of the fact that the Hudson River borders on New Jersey and New York State, there was a question of whether that monopoly included trade that went into the state of New Jersey. Now, interstate is trade that goes between two states, so New York and New Jersey. Intrastate would be between two towns or two cities in the same state. So had the New York shipping company been trading between New York City and Albany, for example, there would have been no reason for this to become a Supreme Court case. But in Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, Marshall once again upheld federalism against states. And in this case, what Marshall ruled was basically that New York State cannot regulate interstate commerce. No state can, for that matter. And it really gives, puts a stamp on the powers of the federal government. And it sets up for eventually what's going to happen, which is that Congress will really regulate interstate commerce for the remainder of our country's history. So there you go. It's a quick one today, just on the Marshall cases. And if you guys have any questions on this, obviously you're more than welcome to bring them to tutoring, which is this week is Thursday. The last thing I want to mention is, remember, tomorrow, third hour kids. You guys are going to come to class, and then we've got to venture on down to the gym.